Chapter 24 of the Golden Dream. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Golden Dream by R.M. Ballantyne. Chapter 24. Ned decides on visiting San Francisco. Larry pays a visit and receives a severe disappointment. The road and the city. Unexpected news. Few joys in this life are altogether without alloy. The delight experienced by Larry O'Neil and Captain Bunting when they heard the hearty tones of Ned Sinton's voice, and the satisfaction with which they beheld his face when, in their anxiety to prevent his falling headlong into the hole, they both sprang out of the tent and rushed into his arms, were somewhat damped on their observing that Tom Collins was not with him. But their anxieties were speedily relieved on learning that Tom was at Sacramento City, and, it was to be hoped, doing well. As Ned had eaten nothing on the day of his arrival since early morning, the first care of his friends was to cook some food for him, and Larry took special care to brew for him, as soon as possible, a stiff tumbler of hot brandy and water, which, as he was wet and weary, was particularly acceptable. While enjoying this over the fire in front of the tent, Ned related the adventures of himself and Tom Collins circumstantially, in the course of which narration he explained what the reader does not yet know, how that, after Tom had recovered from his illness sufficiently to ride, he had conducted him by easy stages to the banks of the great San Joaquin River, down which they had proceeded by boat until they reached Sacramento. Here Ned saw him comfortably settled in the best room of the best hotel in the town, and then, purchasing the largest and strongest horse he could find, he set off, in spite of the rains, to let his comrades know that they were both safe, and, in Ned's case at least, sound. And now, with reference to that letter. "Ah, that letter," echoed the captain. "That's what I've been wanting you to come to. What can it mean?" "I am as ignorant of that as yourself," answered Ned. "If it had only been you who were mentioned in the letter, I could have supposed that your old ship had been relaunched and refitted, and had made a successful voyage to China during your absence; but, as I left no property of any kind in San Francisco, and had no speculations afloat, I cannot conceive what it can be." "Maybe," suggested Larry, "they've heard o' our remarkable talents up here in the diggin's, and they've been successful in getting us appinted to responsible sitations in the new government I've heard they're settin' up down there. I wouldn't object to be prime minister myself, if they'd only allow me enough clerks to do the work." "And did you say you were all ready for a start to morrow, captain?" inquired Ned. "Quite. We've disposed of the claims and tools for $1,500, and we sold our wow along with the lot. That's to say, he remains a fixture at the same wage, and the little we meant to take with us is stowed away in our saddle bags. You see, I couldn't foresee that you'd plump down on us in this fashion, and I felt that the letter was urgent and ought to be acted on at once." "You did quite right," returned Ned. "What a pity I missed seeing Bill Jones at Sacramento; but the city has grown so much, and become so populous in a few months, that two friends might spend a week in it unknown to each other without chancing to meet. And now, as to the gold. Have you been successful since I left?" "Ay," broke in Larry, "that have we. It's a great country entirely for men whose bones and muscles are made o' iron. We've dug $40,000, £8,000 out o' that same hole in the tent; for by spraining the ankles and well nigh breaking the legs o' 8 or 10 miners. It's sorry I'll be to leave it, but after all it's a sickly place, so I'm content to go." "By the way, Larry, that reminds me, I met a friend of yours at the other end of the settlement." "I belave ye," answered Larry. "Ivery man in the Creek's me friend. They'd die for me, they would, if I only axed them." "Ay, but a particular friend, named Kate, who—" "Och! ye don't mane it!" cried the Irishman, starting up with an anxious look. "Sure, they lived up in the dark glen there, and they went off one fine day, and I've niver been able to hear of them since." "They are not very far off," continued Ned, detailing his interview with the brother and sister, and expressing a conviction that the former could not now be in life. "We'll go down to night," said Larry, drawing on his heavy boots. "You'd better wait till to morrow," suggested the captain. "The poor thing will be in no humour to see any one to night, and we can make a halt near the hut for an hour or so." Larry, with some reluctance, agreed to this delay, and the rest of the evening was spent by the little party in making preparations for a start on the following day. But difficulties arose in the way of settling with the purchasers of their claims, so that another day passed ere they got fairly off on their journey towards Sacramento. On reaching the mouth of the little creek, Larry O'Neil galloped ahead of his companions, and turned aside at the little hut, the locality of which Sinton had described to him minutely. Springing off his horse, he threw the reins over a bush and crossed the threshold. It is easier to conceive than to describe his amazement and consternation on finding the place empty. Dashing out, he vaulted into the saddle, and almost galloped through the doorway of the nearest hut in his anxiety to learn what had become of his friends. "Hello, stranger!" shouted a voice from within. "No thoroughfare this way, and I wouldn't advise ye for to go and try for to make one. Oh, countryman, where's the sick Irishman and his sister going that live close to you here?" "Well, they ain't a countryman o' yourn, I guess, but I can answer a civil question. They're gone. The man's dead, and the gal took him away in a cart, day before yesterday." "Gone! Took him away in a cart!" echoed Larry, while he looked aghast at the man. "Are you sure?" "Well, I couldn't be sure. I made the coffin for him, and helped to lift it into the cart." "But where have they gone to?" "To Sacramento, I guess. I advised her not to go, but she mumbled something about not having him buried in such a wild place, and laying him in a churchyard, so I gave her the loan of $50. It was all I could spare, for she hadn't a rap. She borrowed the horse and cart from a countryman who was going to Sacramento at any rate." "You're a trump, you are!" cried Larry with energy. "Give us your hand, me boy. Oh, then your parents were Irish, I'll be bound. Now, here's your $50 back again, with compound interest to boot, though I don't know exactly what that is." "I didn't ask ye for the $50," said the man, somewhat angrily. "Who are you that offers 'em?" "I'm her friend," answered Larry, in some confusion. "Her intimate friend. I might almost say a sort o' distant relation, only not quite that." "Well, if that's all, I guess I'm as much a friend as you," said the man, re-entering his cabin, and shutting the door with a bang. Larry sighed, dropped the $50 into his leather purse, and galloped away. The journey down to Sacramento, owing to the flooded state of the country, was not an easy one. It took the party several days' hard riding to accomplish it, and during all that time Larry kept a vigilant look out for Kate Morgan and the cart, but neither of them did he see. Each day he felt certain he would overtake them, but each evening found him trying to console himself with the reflection that a stern chase is proverbially a long one, and that next day would do it. Thus they struggled on, and finally arrived at the city of Sacramento without having set eyes on the wanderer. Poor Larry little knew that, having gone with a man who knew the road thoroughly, Kate, although she travelled slowly, had arrived there the day before him, while Ned had lengthened the road by unwittingly making a considerable and unnecessary detour. Still less did he know that, at the very hour he arrived in the city, Kate, with her sad charge, embarked on board a small river steamer, and was now on her way to San Francisco. As it was, Larry proposed to start back again, supposing they must have passed them, but on second thoughts he decided to remain where he was and make inquiries. So the three friends pushed forward to the City Hotel to make inquiries after Tom Collins. "Mr. Collins?" said the waiter, bowing to Sinton. "He's gone, sir, about a week ago." "Gone!" exclaimed Ned, turning pale. "Yes, sir, gone down to San Francisco. He saw some advertisement or other in the newspaper, and started off by the next steamer." Ned's heart beat freely again. "Was he well when he left?" "Yes, sir, pretty well. He would have been the better of a longer rest, but he was quite fit to travel, sir." Captain Bunting, who, during this colloquy, had been standing with his legs apart, and his eyes glaring at the waiter as if he had been mad, gave a prolonged whistle, but made no further remark. At this moment Larry, who had been conversing with one of the under waiters, came rushing in with a look of desperation on his countenance. "Would you belave it," he cried, throwing himself down on a splendid crimson sofa, that seemed very much out of keeping with the dress of the rough miners whom it was meant to accommodate, Would you belave it, they're gone!" "Who are gone, and where to?" inquired Ned. "Kate and the coffin. Off to San Francisco be all that's unlucky, and only went little more nor an hour ago." The three friends looked at each other. "Waiter," said Captain Bunting, in a solemn voice, "bear chops for 3, pipes and baccy for 6, and a brandy smash for 1. And, d'ye hear, let it be stiff." "Yes, sir." A loud laugh from Ned and Larry relieved their over excited and pent up feelings, and both agreed that, under the circumstances, the captain's order was the best that could be given at that stage of their perplexities. Having ascertained that there was not another steamer to San Francisco for a week, they resolved to forget their anxieties as much as possible, and enjoy themselves in the great city of Sacramento during the next few days, while they instituted inquiries as to what had become of their comrade, Bill Jones, who they concluded must still be in the city, as they had not met him on the way down. CHAPter 24. Of the Golden Dream. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Golden Dream by R.M. Ballantyne. Chapter 25. Gold not all powerful. Remarkable growth of Sacramento. New style of bringing a hotel into notice. A surprising discovery. Death of a Mexican horse tamer. The concert and another discovery. Mademoiselle Nelina creates a sensation. It is said that gold can accomplish anything, and in some respects the saying is full of truth. In some points of view, however, the saying is altogether wrong. Gold can indeed accomplish almost anything in the material world. It can purchase stone, and metal, and timber, and muscles, bones, thews, and sinews, with life in them, to any extent. It can go a step further. It can purchase brains, intellect, genius, and, throwing the whole together, material and immaterial, it can cut and carve and mould the world to such an extent that its occupants of 50 years ago, were they permitted to return to earth, would find it hard to recognise the scene of their brief existence. But there are things and powers which gold cannot purchase. That worn-out old millionaire would give tons of it for a mere tithe of the health that yonder ploughman enjoys. Youth cannot be bought with gold. Time cannot be purchased with gold. The prompt obedience of thousands of men and women may be bought with that precious metal, but one powerful throb of a loving heart could not be procured by all the yellow gold that ever did or ever will enrich the human family. But we are verging towards digression. Let us return to the simple idea with which we intended to begin this chapter, the wonder-working power of gold. In no country in the wide world, we venture to affirm, has this power been exemplified so strikingly as in California. The knowledge of the discovery of gold was so suddenly and widely disseminated over the earth, that human beings flowed into the formerly uninhabited wilderness like a mighty torrent, while thousands of ships flooded the markets with the necessaries of life. Then gold was found to be so abundant, and, at first, so easily procured, that the fever was kept up at white heat for several years. The result of this was, as we have remarked elsewhere, that changes, worthy of Aladdin's lamp or Harlequin's wand, were wrought in the course of a few weeks, sometimes in a few days. The city of Sacramento was one of the most remarkable of the many strange and sudden growths in the country. The river on which it stands is a beautiful stream, from 200 to 300 yards wide, and navigable by large craft to a few miles above the city. The banks, when our friends were there, were fringed with rich foliage, and the wild trees of the forest itself stood growing in its streets. The city was laid out in the form of a square, with streets crossing each other at right angles. A forest of masts along the Embarcadero attested the growing importance and wealth of the place, and nearly 10,000 inhabitants swarmed in its streets. Many of those streets were composed of canvas tents, or erections scarcely more durable. Yet here, little more than a year before, There were only 4000 in the place. Those who chanced to be in possession of the land here were making fortunes. Lots, 20 feet by 70, in the best situations, brought upwards of $3500. Rents, too, were enormous. One hotel paid $30,000, £6000 per annum; another $35,000. Small stores fetched $10,000 and $12,000 a year, while board at the best hotels was $5 a day. Truly, if gold was plentiful, it was needed, for the common necessaries of life, though plentiful, were bought and sold at fabulous prices. The circulation of gold was enormous, and the growth of the city did not suffer a check even for a day, although the cost of building was unprecedented; and this commercial prosperity continued in spite of the fact that the place was unhealthy, being a furnace in summer, and in winter little better than a swamp. "It's a capital hotel," remarked Captain Bunting to his companions, as they sat round their little table, enjoying their pipes after dinner. "I wonder if they make a good thing out of it." "Sure if they don't," said Larry, tilting his chair on its hind legs, and calmly blowing a cloud of smoke towards the roof. "It's a losin' game they're playin', for they sarve out the grub at a tearin' pace." "They are doing well, I doubt not," said Ned Sinton, "and they deserve to, for the owner, or owners, I don't know how many or few there are, made a remarkable and enterprising start." "How was that?" asked the captain. "I heard of it when I was down here with Tom," continued Sinton. "You must know that this was the first regular hotel opened in the city, and it was considered so great an event that it was celebrated by salvos of artillery, and, on the part of the proprietors, by a great unlimited feast to all who chose to come." "What!" cried Larry, "free, gratis, for nothin'?" "Ay, for nothing. It was done in magnificent style, I assure you. Any one who chose came and called for what he wanted, and got it at once. The attendance was prompt, and as cheerfully given as though it had been paid for. Gin slings, cocktails, mint juleps, and brandy smashes went round like a circular storm; even champagne flowed like water; and venison, wild fowl, salmon, grizzly bear steaks, and pastry all the delicacies of the season, in short, were literally to be had for the asking. What it cost the spirited proprietors I know not, but certainly it was a daring stroke of genius that deserved patronage." "Faix, it did," said Larry, emphatically, "and they shall have it, too. Here, waiter, a brandy smash and a cheroot, and be aisy as to the cost. I think me bank'll stand it." "What say you to a stroll?" said Ned, rising. "By all means," replied Captain Bunting, jumping up and laying down his pipe. Larry preferred to remain where he was, so the two friends left him to enjoy his cheroot, and wandered away, where fancy led, to see the town. There was much to be seen. It required no theatrical representation of life to amuse one in Sacramento at that time. The whole city was a vast series of plays in earnest. Every conceivable species of comedy and farce met the eye at every turn; costumes the most remarkable, men the most varied and peculiar, and things the most incomprehensible and unexpected presented themselves in endless succession. Here a canvas restaurant stood, or rather leaned against a log store; there a tent spread its folds in juxtaposition to a deck cabin, which seemed to have walked ashore from a neighbouring brig without leave, and had been let out as a grog shop by way of punishment. Chinamen in calico jostled sailors in canvas, or diggers in scarlet flannel shirts, or dandies in broadcloth and patent leather, or Red Indians in nothing. Bustle and hurry and uproar and joviality prevailed. A good deal of drinking, too, unfortunately went on, and the results were occasional melodramas, and sometimes serious rows. Tragedies, too, were enacted, but these seldom met the eye. As is usually the case, they were done in the dark. "What have we here?" cried Captain Bunting, stopping before a large placard, and reading, "Grand concert this evening. Wonderful singer. Mademoiselle Nelina, first appearance. Ethiopian serenaders. I say, Ned, we must go to this. I've not heard a song for ages that was worth listening to." "At what hour?" inquired Ned. "Oh, 7 o'clock. Well, we can stroll back to the hotel, have a cup of coffee, and bring Larry O'Neil with us." Come along." That evening our three adventurers occupied the back seat of a large concert room in one of the most crowded thoroughfares of the town, patiently awaiting the advent of the performers. The room was filled to overflowing, long before the hour for the commencement of the performances, with every species of mortal except woman. Women were exceedingly rare creatures at that time. The meetings of all sorts were composed almost entirely of men, in their varied and motley garbs. Considering the circumstances in which it was got up, the room was a very creditable one, destitute indeed of ornament, but well lighted by an enormous wooden chandelier full of wax candles, which depended from the centre of the ceiling. At the further end of the room was a raised stage, with footlights in front and 3 chairs in the middle of it. There was a small orchestra in front, consisting of 2 fiddles, a cornopian, a trombone, a clarionet, and a flute; but at first the owners of these instruments kept out of sight, wisely reserving themselves until that precise moment when the impatient audience would, as all audiences do on similar occasions, threaten to bring down the building with stamping of feet, accompanied with steam engine like whistles and savage cries of "Music!" While Ned Sinton and his friends were quietly looking round upon the crowd, Larry O'Neil's attention was arrested by the conversation of 2 men who sat just in front of him. One was a rough-looking miner in a wide-awake and red flannel shirt; the other was a negro in a shirt of blue striped calico. "Who be this Missy Nelina?" inquired the negro, turning to his companion. "I dun know, but I was here last night, and I'd take my davy I saw the little gal in the ranche of a feller away in the plains 500 miles to the east'ard 2 months ago. Her father, poor chap, was killed by a wild horse." "How was that?" inquired the negro, with an expression of great interest. "Well, it was this way it happened," replied the other, putting a quid of tobacco into his cheek, such as only a sailor would venture to masticate. "I was up at the diggin's about 6 months, without getting more gold than just kept me in life, for you see I was always an unlucky dog, when one day I goes down to my claim, and at the very first lick dug up 2 chunks of gold as big as your fists. So I sold my claim and shovel, and come down here for a spree. Well, as I was sayin', I come to the ranche of a feller called Banji, or Bonji, or Bunji, or some sort o' bang with a G at the end o' it. He was clappin' his little gal on the head when I comed up, and said good bye to her. I didn't rightly hear what she said, but I was so taken with her pretty face that I couldn't help askin' if the little thing was his'n. "Yees," says he, for he was a Mexican, and couldn't come round the English lingo. "She me daughter. I found the man was goin' to catch a wild horse, so says I, `I'll go with you,' and says he, `Come along.' So away we went, slappin' over the plains at a great rate, him and me, and a Yankee, a friend o' his, and 3 or 4 servants, after a drove of wild horses that had been seen that mornin' near the house. Well, away we went after the wild horses. Oh, it was grand sport! The man had lent me one o' his beasts, and it went at such a spankin' pace I could scarce keep my seat, and had to hold on by the saddle, not bein' used to ridin' much, d'ye see. We soon picked out a horse, a splendid lookin' feller, with curved neck, and free gallop, and wide nostrils. My eye! How he did snort and plunge when the Mexican threw the lasso! It went right over his head the first cast, but the wild horse pulled the rope out of his grip. It's all up, thought I, but niver a bit. The Mexican put spurs to his horse, and, while at full gallop, made a dive with his body, and actually caught the end of the line as it trailed over the ground, and recovered his seat again. It was done in a crack, and I believe he held on by means of his spurs, which were big enough, I think, to make wheels for a small carronade. Taking a turn of the line round the horn of his saddle, he reined in a bit, and then gave the spurs for another spurt, and soon after reined in again. In fact, he just played the wild horse like a trap, until he well nigh choked him, and in an hour or less he was led steamin', and startin', and jumpin', into the corral where the man kept his other horses." At this point in the narrative the cries for music became so deafening that the sailor was obliged to pause, to the evident annoyance of the negro, who seemed intensely interested in what he had heard, and also to the regret of Larry, who had listened eagerly the whole time. In a few minutes the music came in the shape of two bald-headed Frenchmen, a wild-looking bearded German, and several lean men who might, as far as appearance went, have belonged to almost any nation, and who would have, as far as musical ability went, been repudiated by every nation, except perhaps the Chinese. During the quarter of an hour in which these performers quieted the impatient audience with sweet sounds, the sailor continued his anecdote. "Well, you see," said he to the negro, while Larry bent forward to listen, "the Mexican mounted, and raced, and spurred him for about an hour; but just at the last the wild horse gave a tremendous leap and a plunge, and we noticed the rider fall forward as if he'd got a sprain. The Yankee and one of the servants ran up and caught the horse by the head, but its rider didn't move. He was stone dead, and was held in his seat by the spurs sticking in the saddle cloth. The last bound must have ruptured some blood vessel inside, for there was no sign of hurt upon him anywhere." "You don't say that!" said the negro, with a look of horror. "'Deed do I; and we took the poor feller home, where his little daughter cried for him as if she'd break her heart. I asked the Yankee what we should do, but he looked at me somewhat offended like, and said he was a relation of the dead man's wife, and could manage the affairs of the family without help, so I bid him good morning and went my way. But I believe in my heart he was tellin' a lie, and that he's no right to go hawking the poor gal about the country in this fashion." Larry was deeply interested in this narrative, and felt so strong a disposition to make further inquiries, that he made up his mind to question the sailor, and was about to address him when a small bell tinkled, the music ceased, and three Ethiopian minstrels, banjo in hand, advanced to the footlights, made their bow, and then seated themselves on the three chairs, with that intensity of consummate, impudent, easy familiarity peculiar to the ebony sons of song. "Go to it, darkies!" shouted an enthusiastic individual in the middle of the room. "Three cheers for the niggers!" roared a sailor, who had just returned from a 12 months' cruise at the mines, and whose delight at the prospect of once more hearing a good song was quite irrepressible. The audience responded to the call with shouts of laughter, and a cheer that would have done your heart good to listen to, while the niggers shewed their teeth in acknowledgment of the compliment. The first song was Lily Dale, and the men, who we need scarcely say were fictitious negroes, sang it so well that the audience listened with breathless attention and evident delight, and encored it vociferously. The next song was "Oh, Massa, how he wopped me," a ditty of quite a different stamp, but equally popular. It also was encored, as indeed was every song sung that evening, but the performers had counted on this. After the third song there was a hornpipe, in the performance of which the dancer's chief aim seemed to be to show in what a variety of complex ways he could shake himself to pieces if he chose. Then there was another trio, and then a short pause, in order duly to prepare the public mind for the reception of the great cantatrice, Mademoiselle Nelina. When she was led to the footlights by the tallest of the three negroes, there was a momentary pause, as if men caught their breath. Then there was a prolonged cheer of enthusiastic admiration; and little wonder, for the creature that appeared before these rough miners seemed more like an angelic visitant than a mortal. There was nothing strikingly beautiful about the child, but she possessed that inexpressibly sweet character of face that takes the human heart by storm at first sight, and this, added to the fact that she was almost the only one of her sex who had been seen for many months by any of those present, that she was fair, blue-eyed, delicate, modestly dressed, and innocent, filled them with an amount of enthusiasm that would have predisposed them to call a scream melodious had it been uttered by Mademoiselle Nelina. But the voice which came timidly from her lips was in harmony with her appearance. There was no attempted execution, and the poor child was too frightened to succeed in imparting much expression to the simple ballad which she warbled. But there was an inherent richness in the tones of her voice that entranced the ear, and dwelt for weeks and months afterwards on the memory of those who heard it that night. It is needless to add that all her songs were encored with rapturous applause. The second song she sang was the popular one, "Erin, My Country," and it created quite a furore among the audience, many of whom were natives of the Green Isle. "Oh, ye purty creature, sing it again, do!" yelled an Irishman in the front seats, while he waved his hat and cheered in mad enthusiasm. The multitude shouted "Encore," and the song was sung for the third time. While it was singing, Larry O'Neil sat with his hands clasped before him, his bosom heaving, and his eyes riveted on the child's face. "Mr Sinton," he said, in a deep, earnest tone, touching Ned on the shoulder, as the last sweet notes of the air were drowned in the thunder of applause that followed Mademoiselle Nelina off the stage, "Mr Sinton, I'd lay me life that it's her." "Who?" inquired Ned, smiling at the serious expression of his comrade's face. "Who but Nelly Morgan, of course. She's the born image o' Kate. They're as like as two peas. Sure, if it's her, I'll know it, I will; and I'll make that black thief of a Yankee captain explain how he come to possess stolen goods." Ned and the captain at first expressed doubts as to Larry's being able to swear to the identity of one whom he had never seen before, but the earnest assurances of the Irishman convinced them that he must be right, and they at once entered into his feelings, and planned, in an eager undertone, how the child was to be communicated with. "It won't do," said Ned, "to tax the man right out with his villainy. The miners would say we wanted to get possession of the child to make money by her." "But if the child herself admitted that the man was not her relative?" suggested Captain Bunting. "Perhaps," returned Ned, "she might at the same time admit that she didn't like the appearance of the strangers who made such earnest inquiries about her, and prefer to remain with her present guardian." "Never fear," said Larry, in a hoarse whisper, "she'll not say that if I tell her I know her sister Kate, and can take her to her. Besides, hasn't she got an Irish heart? And don't I know the way to touch it? Just stay where you are, both of you, and I'll go behind the scenes. The niggers are comin' on again, so I'll try. Maybe there's nobody there but herself." Before they could reply, Larry was gone. In a few minutes he reached the front seats, and, leaning his back against the wall, as if he were watching the performers, he gradually edged himself into the dark corner where the side curtains shut off the orchestra from the public. To his great satisfaction he found that this was only secured to the wall by one or two nails, which he easily removed, and then, in the midst of an uproarious laugh, caused by a joke of the serenaders, he pushed the curtain aside, and stood before the astonished gaze of Mademoiselle Nelina, who sat on a chair with her hands clasped and resting on her knee. Unfortunately for the success of Larry's enterprise, he also stood before the curtain raiser, a broad, sturdy man, in rough miner's costume, whose back was turned towards him, but whose surprised visage instantly faced him on hearing the muffled noise caused by his entry. There was a burly negro also in the place, seated on a small stool, who looked at him with unqualified astonishment. "Halloo! what do you want?" exclaimed the curtain raiser. "Tearin' ages!" cried Larry, in amazement. "May I niver! Sure it's dreamin' I am, and the ghost o' Bill Jones is come to see me." It was indeed no other than Bill Jones who stood revealed before him, but no friendly glance of recognition did his old comrade vouchsafe him. He continued, after the first look of surprise, to frown steadily on the intruder. "You've the advantage of me, young man," said Bill, in a stern though subdued tone, for he feared to disturb the men on the stage. "Moreover, you've comed in where you've no right to be. When a man goes where he shouldn't ought to, and things looks as if they wasn't all square, in them circumstances, blow high or blow low, I always goes straight for'ard and shoves him out. If he don't shove easy, why, put on more steam, that's what I say." "But sure you don't forget me, Bill?" pleaded Larry, in amazement. "Well, p'raps I don't, and p'raps I do. When I last enjoyed the dishonour o' your acquaintance, you was a blackguard. It ain't likely you're improved, so be good enough to back your topsails and clear out." Bill Jones pointed as he spoke to the opening through which Larry had entered, but suddenly changing his mind, he said, "Hold on, there's a back door, and it'll be easier to kick you through that than through the concert room." So saying, Bill seized Larry O'Neil by the collar, and led that individual, in a state of helpless and wondering consternation, through a back door, where, however, instead of kicking him out, he released him, and suddenly changed his tone to an eager whisper. "Oh, Larry, lad, I'm glad to see you. Wherever did you come from? I've no time to speak. Uncle Ned's just buried, and Jim Crow comes on in 3 minutes. I had to pretend, you know, 'cause it wouldn't do to let Jim see I knowed you. That was him on the stool. I know what brought you here, and I've found out who she is. Where do you stop?" Larry's surprise just permitted him to gasp out the words "City Hotel," when a roar of laughter and applause met their ears, followed by the tinkle of a small bell. Bill sprang through the doorway, and slammed the door in his old comrade's face. It would be difficult to say, looking at that face on that particular time, whether the owner thereof was mad or drunk, or both, so strangely did it wrinkle and contort as it gradually dawned upon its owner that Bill Jones, true to his present profession, was acting a part; that he knew about the mystery of Mademoiselle Nelina, was now acquainted with his, Larry's, place of abode, and would infallibly find him out after the concert was over. As these things crossed his mind, Larry smote his thigh so often and so vigorously that he ran the risk of being taken up for unwarrantably discharging his revolver in the streets, and he whistled once or twice so significantly that at least 5 stray dogs answered to the call. At last he hitched up the band of his trousers, and, hastening round to the front door, essayed to re-enter the concert room. "Pay here, please," cried the money taker, in an extremely nasal tone, as he passed the little hole in the wall. "We've paid already," answered Larry. "Show your cheque, then." "Sure, I don't know what that is." The doorkeeper smiled contemptuously, and shut down with a bang the bar that kept off the public. Larry doubled his fist, and flushed crimson. Then he remembered the importance of the business he had on hand, and quietly drew the requisite sum from his leather purse. "Come along," said he to Ned Sinton, on re-entering the room. "I've seed her. And Bill Jones, too." "Bill Jones!" cried Ned and the captain simultaneously. "Whist!" said Larry. "Don't be making people obsarve us. Come along home, it's all right. We'll tell you all about it when we're out." In another minute the 3 friends were in the street, conversing eagerly and earnestly as they hastened to their quarters through the thronged and noisy streets of Sacramento. CHAPTER 26 of the Golden Dream. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Golden Dream by R.M. Ballantyne. Chapter 26. Deep Plots and Plans. Bill Jones relates his misadventures. Mademoiselle Nelina consents to run off with Larry O'Neil. A Yankee musician outwitted. The Escape. As Larry had rightly anticipated, Bill Jones made his appearance at the City Hotel the moment the concert was over, and found his old comrades waiting anxiously for him. It did not take long to tell him how they had discovered the existence of Nelly Morgan, as we shall now call her, but it took much longer to drag from Bill the account of his career since they last met, and the explanation of how he came to be placed in his present circumstances. "You see, friends," said he, puffing at a pipe, from which, to look at him, one would suppose he derived most of his information, "this is how it happened. When I set sail from the diggings to come here for grub, I had a pleasant trip at first, but after a little things began to look bad. The feller that steered us lost his reckoning, and so we took 2 or 3 wrong turns by way of making short cuts. That's always how it is. There's a proverb somewhere." "In Milton, maybe, or Napier's Book o' Logarithms," suggested Captain Bunting. "P'raps it was, and p'raps it wasn't," retorted Bill, stuffing the end of his little finger, if such a diminutive may be used in reference to any of his fingers, into the bowl of his pipe. "I rayther think myself it was in Bell's Life or the Royal Almanac. Howsever, that's what it is. When you've got a short road to go, Don't try to make it shorter, say I." "And when you've got a long story to tell, don't try to make it longer," interrupted Larry, winking at his comrade through the smoke of his pipe. "Well, as I was sayin'," continued Bill doggedly, "we didn't get on so well after a bit, but somehow or other we got here at last, and cast anchor in this very hotel. Off I goes at once and buys a cart and a mule, and then I sets to work to lay in provisions. Now, d'ye see, lads, 'twould have been better if I had bought the provisions first, and the mule and the cart after, for I had to pay ever so many dollars a day for their keep. At last I got it all square, packed tight and tied up in the cart, barrels of flour, and kegs of pork, and beans, and brandy, and what not, and away I went alone, for d'ye see I carry a compass, and when I've once made a voyage, I never need to be told how to steer. But my troubles began soon. There's a ford across the river here which I was told I'd have to cross, and sure enough so I did, but it's as bad as Niagara, if not worse, and when I gets half-way over, we was capsized, and went down the river keel up. I dunno yet very well how I got ashore, but I did somehow." "And did the cart go for it?" inquired Captain Bunting, aghast. "No, the cart didn't. She's stranded half a mile further down, on a rock, where she lies to this hour, with the wheels smashed, and the bottom out, and about 3,000 tons of water swashin' right through her every hour. But all the provisions and the mule went slap down the Sacramento, and if they haven't been picked up on the way, they're cruising off the port of San Francisco by this time." The unfortunate seaman stopped at this point to relight his pipe, while his comrades laughingly commented on his misadventure. "Ah, ye may laugh, but I can tell ye it weren't a thing to be laughed at, and at this hour I've scarce $1 to rub against another." "Never mind, my boy," said Ned, as he and the others laughed loud and long at the lugubrious visage of their comrade. "We've got well-lined pockets, I assure you, and of course we have your share of the profits of our joint concern to hand over whenever you wish it." The expression of Bill Jones's face was visibly improved by this piece of news, and he went on with much greater animation. "Well, my story's short now. I comed back here, and by chance fell in with this feller, this Yankee nigger, who offered me $5 a day to haul up the curtain, and do a lot of dirty work, such as bill sticking, and lighting the candles, and sweeping the floor. But it's hard work, I tell you, to live on so little in such a place as this, where everything's so dear." "You're not good at a bargain, I fear," remarked Sinton. "But what of the little girl?" "Well, I was comin' to that. You see, I felt sure from some things I overheard that she wasn't the man's daughter, so one day I axed her who she was, and she said she didn't know, except that her name was Nellie Morgan. So it comed across me that Morgan was the name of the Irish family you was so thick with up at the diggin's, Larry, and I was goin' to ask if she knowed them, when Jolly, that's the name of the getter up at the concerts, catched me talkin', and he took her away sharp, and said he'd thank me to leave the girl alone. I've been watchin' to have another talk with her, but Jolly's too sharp for me, and I haven't spoken to her yet." Larry manifested much disappointment at this termination, for he had been fully prepared to hear that the girl had made Bill her confidant, and would be ready to run away with him at a moment's notice. However, he consoled himself by saying that he would do the thing himself, and, after arranging that Bill was to tell Nellie that a friend of his knew where her sister was, and would like to speak with her, they all retired to rest, at least to rest as well as they could, in a house which, like all the houses in California, swarmed with rats. Next night Bill Jones made a bold effort, and succeeded in conveying Larry's message to Nellie very adroitly, as he thought, while she was standing close to him, waiting for Mr Jolly to lead her to the footlights. The consequence was that the poor child trembled like a leaf when she attempted to sing, and finally fainted on the stage, to the consternation of a crowded house. The point was gained, however. Nellie soon found an opportunity of talking in private with Bill Jones, and appointed to meet Larry in the street next morning early, near the City Hotel. It was with trembling eagerness, mixed with timidity, that she took the Irishman's arm when they met, and asked if he really knew where her sister was. "Oh, how I've longed for her! But are you sure you know her?" "Know her!" said Larry, with a smile. "Do I know meself?" This argument was unanswerable, so Nelly made no reply, and Larry went on. "Yes, I know her, and faix I hope to know her better. But here's her picture for you." Larry then gave the earnest listener at his side a graphic description of her sister Kate's personal appearance, and described her brother also, but he did not at that time acquaint her with the death of the latter. He also spoke of Black Jim, and described the circumstances of her being carried off. "So you see, darlin'," said he, "I know all about you, and now I want you to tell me what happened to you after that." "It's a sad story," said the child in a low tone, as if her mind were recalling melancholy incidents in her career. Then she told rapidly how she had been forsaken by those to whom she had been entrusted, and left to perish in the mountain snow, and how, in her extremity, God had sent help, how another party of emigrants found her and carried her on, how, one by one, they all died, till she was left alone a second time, and how a Mexican horseman found her and carried her to his home, and kept her there as his adopted daughter, till he was killed while taming a wild horse. After that, Nelly's story was a repetition of what Larry had already overheard accidentally in the concert room. "Now, dear," said Larry, "we haven't time to waste. Will you go with me to San Francisco?" The tones of the rough man's voice, rather than his words, had completely won the confidence of the poor child, so she said "Yes," without hesitation. "But how am I to escape from Mr Jolly?" she added. "He has begun to suspect Mr Jones, I say, quite well." "Lave that to me, darlin', and do you kape as much as you can in the house the next day or two, and be lookin' out for what may turn up. Good day to you, mavourneen. We must part here for fear we're seen by any lynx-eyed blackguards. Kape up your heart." Nelly walked quickly away, half laughing at and half perplexed by the ambiguity of her new friend's parting advice. The four friends now set themselves to work to outwit Mr Jolly, and rob him of Mademoiselle Nelina. At last they hit upon a device, which did not indeed say much for the ingenuity of the party, but which, like many other bold plans, succeeded admirably. A steamer was to start in 3 days for San Francisco, one of those splendid new vessels which, like floating palaces, had suddenly made their appearance on these distant waters, having made the long and dangerous voyage from the United States round the Horn. Before the steamer started, Larry contrived to obtain another interview with Nelly Morgan, and explained their plan, which was as follows. On the day of the steamer's sailing, a few hours before the time of starting, Mr Jolly was to receive the following letter, dated from a well-known ranch 30 miles up the river. "Sir, I trust that you will forgive a perfect stranger addressing you, but the urgency of the case must be my excuse. There is a letter lying here for you, which I have reason to know contains information of the utmost importance to yourself, but which, owing to circumstances that I dare not explain in a letter that might chance to fall into wrong hands, must be opened here by your own hands. It will explain all when you arrive. Meanwhile, as I am a perfect stranger to the state of your finances, I send you a sufficient quantity of gold dust by the bearer to enable you to hire a horse and come up. Pray excuse the liberty I take, and believe me to be your obedient servant, "Edward Sinton." At the appointed time Larry delivered this epistle, and the bag of gold, into Mr Jolly's hands, and, saying that no answer was required, hurried away. If Mr Jolly had been suddenly informed that he had been appointed Secretary of State to the King of Ashantee, he could not have looked more astonished than when he perused this letter, and weighed the bag of gold in his hand. The letter itself, had it arrived alone, might, very likely would, have raised his suspicions, but accompanied as it was by a bag of gold of considerable value, it commended itself as a genuine document, and the worthy musician was in the saddle half an hour later. Before starting, he cautioned Nelly not to quit the house on any account whatever, a caution which she heard but did not reply to. 3 hours later Mr Jolly reached his destination, and had the following letter put into his hands. "Sir, By the time you receive this, your late charge, Mademoiselle Nelina, will be on her way to San Francisco, where you are welcome to follow her, and claim her from her sister, if you feel so disposed. I am, sir, etc., Edward Sinton. We need not repeat what Mr Jolly said, or try to imagine what he felt on receipt of this letter. About the time it was put into his hands, the magnificent steamer at the embarcadero gave a shrill whistle, then it panted violently, the paddles revolved, and our adventurers were soon steaming swiftly down the noble river on their way to San Francisco. CHAPTER XXVII.